if you want to do true product-led growth, you've got to start small and offer things to your customers that don't require a lot of technical savviness to implement. And if they do require technical savviness to implement, you're going to need to work really hard, nights and weekends probably, in addition to your full-time job, on writing documentation, on thinking through onboarding tools, help videos, and so forth.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wes Bush. I'm the author of the book on product-led growth. And here I have Ramley, my co-host, and Jeff, who is the head of product marketing at Clearbit. And so we're really excited today to really just dive into how Jeff approaches product marketing, especially in a bunch of different kinds of companies. So he's also had experience working at Envision, and also has a lot of experience with sales-led and product-led businesses and what you need to take into consideration when in each of those businesses. So how do you really decide for companies, like, should you have this completely self-service model or have sales kind of lead the whole sales process?
So I really like the list of tidal waves that you've written about in a couple different places. One being that product experiences are an essential part of the buying process, and it's not just the product experience is what makes us like the product, but it's also that the product experience needs to be good enough that we're going to want to upgrade it. It needs to do a lot of the selling. And I think that unless your company is dedicated to self-serve, to product-led growth, it's unlikely you're going to be able to rally the troops, the product team, the engineering team, executives, marketing, et cetera, to build a product that has a great enough experience that's going to do that conversion on its own. So I think most companies should start out with product-led growth, with this self-serve model. Second, you mentioned that buyers like to self-educate as well. And I think that unless you're doing product-led growth, it's unlikely you're going to take the time as a team to write all that documentation, to write all that help literature, to make the help videos, to really think about in-app messaging to lead somebody along, right? You're probably going to skip that step and go work on something else. It's not always the case. I think one of the keys here is not to generalize, but leading with product-led growth, you're probably going to think about those things sooner than later. And then third, you made that point about startups are more expensive to grow these days. And that, let's say I'm trying to drive to a hand raiser for a demo request for the sales team. That could get very expensive in terms of trade shows and webinars and white papers I'm trying to create and so forth. And that if you can have the product do a lot of the selling, then you can be able to minimize that spend. Now, the caveat here is that if you look at a lot of these successful product-led growth companies, you really look at the books, they're spending a lot of money on advertising. I talked to hundreds of unicorn, and under startup execs as part of my job, and a lot of them are spending a tremendous amount on advertising. So that's the dirty little secret in product-led growth, is that at some point you probably will throw ads at this. I think two other things that are important about product-led growth, or three other things, would be, when you lead with product-led growth, it inspires your product engineering design team to take real ownership of revenue. And a sales-driven culture, oftentimes product-led, the product and design and engineering team maybe can take a back seat to thinking about revenue, right? They'll measure themselves on other types of metrics, and the sales team is really pushing on it, and they're bringing back feedback in terms of what's going to help grow revenue. But when you don't have a sales team to bring back that information, you have to own that as a product team, right? And so you start to get more disciplined about looking at in-app usage data. Where are people falling off in the onboarding process? Why aren't they signing up once they visit the site? Why are they churning after a year and not, renewing with their credit card payment? You really have to look at that data, because there's no one else to start thinking about that. There's no other sales team or other department that's going to think about that. So I think it makes you more disciplined as a company to be data-driven. And then third, every sales team within a product-led growth company that comes later, they will tell you that the leads that come from product-led growth, those freemium leads, are sometimes the best leads to upsell into enterprise plans. It's really hard to go from cold lead to sold versus they've been in freemium, they did some credit card upgrades, and then you say, hey, would you like to have these extra features that are only part of our enterprise plan? The thing that I want to caution people against, and I'm going to share my screen real quick here. So almost every single product-led growth company, many famous ones that have gone public recently, they're touted as PLG. Almost all of them have added a sales team at some point. One of the reasons is this, is that if you look at the self-serve revenue of many companies, there hits a point, maybe it's 20 million, maybe it's 30 million, maybe it's 10 million, where that self-serve revenue for some reason starts to plateau. And it might be that there's just only so much money you can make off of credit card sales. And then if you want to make more money from a company, maybe you have to get purchasing involved, and purchasing might not want to be able to pay with a credit card. They might have to work with a salesperson to pay in another way, right? Or maybe you've sold to one type of job title in a company, one type of persona, but now you want to sell to other types of job titles who don't necessarily like to self-serve. Maybe they like, to have their hands held. Maybe they're purchasing departments, maybe they're legal, what have you. So at some point, a lot of times this self-serve revenue plateaus, and you can beat your head against the wall with it, or you can include another lever, and that is a sales team. And this has happened for a lot of PLG companies, is that at some point, maybe it's 20 million, the sales team is brought on, that company has taken investment from investors, the VCs are like, why don't you just hire a sales team? You've got other execs saying in past companies, we hired a sales team, why aren't we doing this? You can resist it if you want and see if you can, figure a way out. But a lot of companies add that sales team, and they find that while the self-serve revenue starts to go kind of like this, flatten out or goes down, the enterprise revenue starts to go up, because that sales team is able to say, with the freemium model, go consolidate. They could go to legal, they could go to purchasing and say, hey, there's all these rogue accounts out there, credit cards and so forth. Wouldn't you like to consolidate? Or you have all of your IP that's in various parts throughout the company. Wouldn't you like to consolidate so you have a better view of all of that? Or we have these extra kind of security offerings that only our enterprise plan has. And so they're able to really sell bigger deals with it. What's more, a lot of times these salespeople have a vested interest commission in order to sell these bigger deals that require lots of wrangling of different decision makers, the marketing department, the product department, legal, and so forth. So I would say that you're probably going to want at some point to at least consider it. You don't have to do it. There are some edge cases, but you want to consider it.
And I guess, sorry, you go.
I'm really curious when you think the companies should start with introducing sales into the organization. You talked about like raising a certain amount of money. Is that it? Is that like when the VC start pressuring you, or should companies be more proactively asking themselves, like, should we start introducing sales into the organization when you started off with self-serve?
So I think there's a couple ways to address that one. And let's take when you form the company. I think you have to be really self-aware as a founder when you're just like a couple employees about what kind of product are you selling and what your talents are in terms of making that product led, and then what's the buyer going to be like. So I made this kind of graphic here to show you, like on one axis, you've got difficulty to implement the product, which can be improved with all kinds of product-led growth initiatives, right? Versus another axis is the DIY tech savviness of the buyer. And I took some different products I've worked on, throughout my work history. Let's take like a workflow tool, like a prototyping tool, like with Envision. The DIY tech savviness could range. You could have a designer that is really good at, implementing something on their own and, be fine. You might have a marketer though that wants to do some wireframing that isn't that savvy and they want their hand held, right? So it can be somewhere in, low end of need for tech savviness versus the medium end. But let's take something like an SDK, okay? Like a mapping SDK, the DIY tech savviness of the buyer to really do custom, work with that SDK is going to need to be pretty high. And the difficulty to implement is a little bit, greater than medium, right? Or let's take something like MarTech, like a customer data platform. A customer data platform, like if it's an email service provider tool, like, say like Campaign Monitor, pretty easy to implement, right? I can do that self-serve all day. But what if it's something where you're tracking web behavior and you need to add the tag to the site? right? That's a little bit harder for a marketer to get started on. And then some marketers are very savvy about it. I've worked with some marketers that, yeah, I just added that in an hour. Others like, I don't understand what you're even asking of me, right? Location-based app. When we launched Meridian, we thought that venues, museums, stadiums, et cetera, were just going to be able to manually add their own maps to the app and then use our WYSIWYG editor to build this app. Turned out it was harder than we thought, right? And so we had to kind of get in there and help them with it. So I think the key is to kind of think through, like, how hard will it be to implement this? Are we capable? Do we have the work ethic and the skills to make this easier to implement, whether it's doing app messaging, lots of documentation, videos, all that. And then second, get really clear about your buyer. Is the buyer going to be tech savvy in general, or will there be only edge cases where they're tech savvy?
How do you go about making your product easier for people to implement?
I think some products are harder to make easy to implement than others. And I think that's where that self-awareness comes in, right? So there are just some products that there's going to be more inherent friction in deploying it. So for example, I don't know if I can make it much easier to add Wi-Fi access points to a building and test all that to see if they're working well. Like, I've seen extremely talented networking engineers working for large venues have challenge with this and need to bring in a specialist to figure it out, right? And so for that, it's going to be really tough to like ever avoid, Cisco and Aruba and all them. It'll be very difficult for those companies to ever avoid having sales engineers and salespeople and solution experts and so forth. However, let's take something like MarTech. Well, one thing you can do is, in order to first get traction, is not to have an offering that requires anything difficult, right? So you can focus. It's back to the whole notion of focus. And so maybe, like, instead of starting with a product that requires adding a JavaScript tag to the site, maybe you start with some type of simple workflow tool, like sending emails or easier implementation of Facebook ads, something like that, but it doesn't take into account any behavioral data from the website, right? And I'm starting to get into the weeds about all these different products, I realize, but I think it's easier to kind of give specific examples. And then later, add on something like that requires someone to add the JS tag to their site. But maybe instead of requiring them to add the JS tag to the site, you go get a partnership with Google Tag Manager, where your JS tag is already built inherently into Google Tag Manager, and it's just touch a button and it goes into on your site, right? So I think you have to just kind of really think through, is our vision of conquering the world and being all things to all people, is that too far reaching for product-led growth today? And can we evolve into that? And the challenge with this is that it oftentimes runs counter to what investors want from you, right? Investors want to know that you will quickly, oftentimes, be all things to all people and capture different segments of the market. And I think there's a trend moving in the direction of, if you want to do true product-led growth, you've got to start small and offer things to your customers that don't require a lot of technical savviness to implement. And if they do require technical savviness to implement, you're going to need to work really hard, nights and weekends probably, in addition to your full-time job, on writing documentation, on thinking through onboarding tools, help videos, and so forth.